Microsoft Intune keeps getting better and better with more features and capabilities added every few months. With all the changes that happened over the last year, I think it's time we take a step back and look at what Intune is and how it works. In this video, I'm going to explain how Intune works, highlight some of the key features, and show how it simplifies device and app management. As you know, I keep my intros short, but I do want to ask you to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate that. Let's get into it. So, Intune is a mobile device management and mobile application management solution. Actually, these days Microsoft are simply referring to it as a device management solution because it's not just about mobile devices like iOS and Android. In fact, the mobile device management term comes from the inbuilt agent on the device, which is typically known as the MDM provider. Anyway, it works with tools like Microsoft Entra ID, Microsoft 365, and Windows Autopilot, as well as Apple Business Manager and Android Enterprise. It allows you to control who can access company data, which devices are allowed in the organization, and how data is protected. Let's get started with device management. Now, Intune supports all the major platforms: Windows, macOS, iOS, Android, Linux, and you can manage devices from a single console, enforcing policies, deploying updates, and tracking compliance. It's designed to make device management consistent across your organization. I'll jump into the Intune console and give you a quick overview of where device management lives in Intune. So from the Intune console, which is this one here, intune.microsoft.com, we have device management. We have devices here. Now, when I click into devices, you'll see I have some devices that already can be managed. So I have 10 Windows devices, 2 iOS and iPadOS devices, and 9 macOS devices. This is a good overview. But how do you get devices into Intune? Well, for that, we need to take a little step back. Intune is not a free product. You need a license in order to be able to use Intune. Now, a lot of organizations already have the required license. Normally, an organization will have a Microsoft 365 E3 or E5 or Business Premium license, and each of these comes with Microsoft Intune. Now, the reason you'll have that is because Microsoft 365 E3 is the thing you need for email, and it gives you security alongside the email access that you need for your organization. So, as I say, most companies will already have the required license for Microsoft Intune. It is possible to buy Microsoft Intune on its own as a standalone license. The issue there, though, and a little warning for you, is that if you just buy the Microsoft Intune license on its own without the surrounding features, then you're not going to get any of the surrounding features. So you're not going to get automatic enrollment that you get with Azure AD Premium or Entra ID Premium P1 these days. So it's very important that Intune, yes, you need an Intune license in order to be able to manage devices via Intune, but you also need the surrounding licenses to get the best from Intune. So like I say, the main licenses that you will have as an organization are M365 E3, M365 E5, or Microsoft 365 Business Premium. If you haven't got those, do try and figure out the best license combination with your licensing provider to get Intune and Entra ID along with Office 365. Anyway, enough about licensing. Make sure your users have a license. That's all I need to say, really. They need an Intune license and ideally an Entra ID Premium license in order to get the best from Intune. So let's assume users have a license. Now, if I go into Entra ID, which is entra.microsoft.com, and I don't need to talk about licensing, so that's fine. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to go to Settings and then Mobility, because that's the other thing we need to make sure is enabled or switched on or configured. Now, by default, Intune will be here. So Intune will already have this entry here in this list. This, by the way, is a list of all the MDMs that Entra supports in your organization. I can add more. I could simply add AirWatch by Omnissa. I could add AppTech 360. I could add all of these different MDMs and manage my devices via these MDMs in Entra ID. But this video is about Intune, so I'm going to talk about Intune. But like I said, this could be a list of all your different MDMs, and these are the settings that are in Entra ID for this MDM. So, for example, if I choose Microsoft Intune, we have the MDM user scope. Now it's either all or some or none. And it's important to understand that if Intune is your only MDM, you're going to be wanting to set this to all. There's no good reason to set this to some or none if Intune is the MDM that you want to use to manage your devices. You would choose some and then specify the group if you had other MDMs that were used in your organization. Let's say one part of the organization, maybe the finance team, uses AirWatch rather than Intune. That would be why you would use this MDM user scope and be selective about which users you can enroll devices into Intune. So all is where it should be. These are all default. Leave these alone. That's absolutely fine. Now, Windows Information Protection is not something I'm going to be covering in this video, and for the majority of the time, almost always, this will be set to none. Do not set it to some or all unless you definitely have a plan for how you would use Windows Information Protection. Very important. Leave this to none. It's not going to help you. It's actually going to really make things difficult for you if you do set that to some or all. So leave it as none, and if you want to figure out why, go and look it up. So leave it to none. So when we've got this set to all up at the top here, all good, we're ready to go. Now, a user who has a license and who is within this scope, in this case all users, then they will be able to enroll a device. Now, it's important to talk about device state because that's important when we figure out how we can get devices into Intune. There are 3 possible device states that can be managed by Intune. They are registered devices. Now, a registered device is one that has been registered into Entra ID, but has not been joined to Entra ID and is not hybrid joined to Entra ID. So in order to explain that, I'm going to have to explain what those other 2 things are, but let's start with registered because it's the easiest for me to explain for now. So a registered device is simply one that, it's probably a user's personal device really, and they've gone to Office 365 on the web. Now when they do that, the device becomes registered with Entra ID. That's just how that works. You will see that entry in Entra ID, and if I go over to the devices blade and choose all devices in Entra, you will see I've got some here over on the right. Let me minimize this a bit. Over on the right, and on the join type, you can see I've got a Entra joined, hybrid joined, and also Entra registered. Now this happens to be a Mac, but that would work exactly the same for a Windows device. So a device that is not joined to Entra ID and is not hybrid joined, but is in Entra, will be registered to Entra ID. Now it's important to understand that this essentially means you can still enroll it into Intune, you can still manage it via Intune, but it's not going to fundamentally change how the device is logged into or managed from an identity perspective. So it's still that user's device. The user will still be using their normal username and password that they have configured on their device in order to get into that device. That's the joined state. It's just registered, which means the information, the metadata about it has been registered in Entra ID. We've not changed how the user logs in. But I can still, if I want to, I can still ask them to enroll that device and manage it via Intune and do most things with that device, like the device management stuff we're going to go into in a few, like the device management stuff we're going to go into in a few moments. So that's registered. The other type is joined. This is where the device is fully Entra joined. The user on that device will be logging in as their Entra ID credentials. They'll be typing, at least the first time, they will be typing their Entra username and password, and then maybe afterwards they'd be using their fingerprint or their face in order to log in. But the identity is the Entra ID identity. And for that, we can still manage that via Intune. Normally, you would do auto enrollment when a device becomes Entra joined. You would automatically manage it via Intune for the user, but you don't have to, and that's not always the case. The third option is hybrid Entra ID joined. And hybrid Entra ID joined is simply that the start device state was on premises. It was using Active Directory to manage that device. It still is using Active Directory to manage that device. And when you use something like Entra ID Connect on your domain to synchronize that device information up to Entra ID, it becomes a hybrid Entra joined device. Now the identity, the user who's logging in, won't suddenly have to start using their Entra ID credentials, they will still be using their on-premises credentials to log in, but because it's hybrid, that's probably the same thing. Their on-premises credentials probably are synchronized up to their Entra ID credentials, so it doesn't really matter which one they're using because they are exactly the same. They're synchronized together. So it's important to understand that the Entra joined doesn't have any link to an on-premises environment at all, whereas hybrid Entra joined does have reliance on the on-premises infrastructure, which means that if your domain controller goes down, after a little while, your user's not going to be able to log in. Okay, so those are the three device states. Now, for a registered device, we can force the user to enroll their device when they try to access the Office app on the web. And we could use something like conditional access to say, actually, your device needs to be compliant in order to access this resource. And then they would be told to download the company portal and register their device. Now, that's uncommon these days. One, because usually we give devices to users centrally. We normally build them as an organization, make sure they're fully managed, and then give them to a user. Or we build them using something like Windows Autopilot and give them to the user. But either way, they're fully managed devices that are either hybrid or Entra joined. Normally, we don't just give a laptop to a user and say, off you go, have fun, figure it out for yourself. So we normally don't have corporate devices in the registered state, which means that when we do come across a registered device, it's normally a person's own device. It's the computer they own. They've purchased it. It's their own device that they use for many different things, watching Netflix and doing other things, as well as maybe work. And if your company allows that, BYOD, then fantastic, and that device is registered. You probably don't want to also manage that device via Intune. You could, but it's unusual these days. So when it comes to enrolling an Entra joined device, I mentioned earlier on that you probably would do something like auto-enrollment when you do an Entra join in the first place. So normally you don't have to think about how you will enroll it because it will automatically be enrolled when it becomes joined or built. We can also use something like Windows Autopilot to automatically enroll that device for the end user. We normally don't need to go ahead and figure out how we enroll an Entra join device. It should already be done through that join process. And finally, with hybrid Entra join, well, this really should be set up centrally. You really should have a process for devices that are hybrid joined automatically enrolling into Intune when they get built or when they get hybrid joined, because we shouldn't be asking users to enroll their device. So the end state of a device becoming hybrid joined or Entra joined and managed by Intune is something like this. As you can see, I've got this laptop for a user called Adele Vance, and if we go into accounts and then scroll down to the bottom of where it says access work or school, you can see it's connected to Adele, connected by Adele V at nextcoffee.co.uk, and it's connected to Last Coffee's Entra ID. And this means that it's Entra joined, and you can also see that it's Intune managed because we have this managed by Last Coffee and then the info button here. If I click into the info button, we see stuff about the agent itself, and we can actually synchronize it and do various things on that device. We also can see that it's probably been enrolled via Autopilot because there's no way this user can disconnect this. So it's definitely a corporate device. And if I choose info, you can see we've got areas managed by Last Coffee, we've got Defender, device health and security, and then some applications as well. So that's definitely an Entra joined device. And you can also tell that because if I go down to start, you can see that we have them signed in as Adele V at nextcoffee.co.uk. This is not hybrid. This is an Entra joined device, and that's ideally the state most of your devices would be in the next few years. Heading back over to the Intune portal, you can see I'm in the devices blade here, and we have the device platforms that we manage. Now, I mentioned Windows. I talked about how we can enroll Windows devices automatically via Entra ID. So that's these here. We also have macOS, iPadOS, iOS, Android, and Linux. Now, if I just quickly go into iPadOS and iOS, we have enrollment at the top here, and we need an MDM push certificate in order to manage Apple devices via Intune. So this screen you see here, this information here, refers to all Apple devices. You can see I'm already in the iOS and iPadOS, but if I was to skip out and go down to macOS and then enrollment, exactly the same screen here as you just saw in iOS and iPadOS. It's just a different view for the enrollment section. Enrolling all Apple devices needs this MDM push certificate to be enabled, and then we have all these options light up. And it's a much longer discussion to go into how we can bulk enroll Apple devices, so I'm not going to cover that just yet. In the same way, I'm not going to cover the Windows Autopilot just yet, because I have another video, the Ultimate Guide to Windows Autopilot is already available, and I have a few videos about Apple Business Manager as well, so I'm not going to cover those. Back down to devices, we have Android, and in enrollment we have exactly the same situation. We need that prerequisite of the Manage Google Play account, and then these additional items light up. And when it comes to Linux, there's a slightly different situation because we don't have a formal enrollment process and management within Linux. We can simply enroll the devices via scripts and push scripts to these devices and then manage their compliance through Intune as well. So it's slightly different to the Windows, iOS, Android, and macOS. Okay, next let's look at application management. Intune lets you deploy apps from the Microsoft Store, Apple App Store, Google Play, or even your own custom apps. For personal mobile devices, we can also use App Protect policy to secure work data without affecting personal apps or data. This is especially useful for BYOD scenarios where users may not want their personal device to be fully managed by the business. Let's jump into the console. I'll show you how we can manage applications. So in the Intune console, we have the apps section, and we can go to all apps and have a look at all the apps that we've got in the organization, or we can choose by platform. And with by platform, you can see it's just split out into all the different platforms that we support. When it comes to adding an app, we can choose add, and then we select the app type. Now I mentioned that you can use the Android Store, the iOS App Store. We have the Microsoft Store new and the legacy Microsoft App Store, and also we can deploy a managed Google Play app. We can also scroll down to this bottom of this list. We can also deploy a Win32 application, which is a traditional Windows application, or a line of business application, which it's like an MSI, for example, in Windows, or PKG in Apple. The final thing I want to show you in devices is that when we go into the devices list I've got here, you can see all the devices that I have. I've got a few devices. Most of them are non-compliant because I'm doing a lot of testing, but you can see who it's managed by. So this is managed by Intune as opposed to MDE, which is Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, which is a separate topic altogether. So most of these will be managed by Intune. Now, when I go to configuration, this is where we can deploy configuration to these devices. In this case, I'm in the Windows section, so all of these configurations are Windows configurations. I can choose create, new policy, select Windows 10 and later, and then ideally select the settings catalog, and then type a name, add settings, and then either search for a specific setting or scroll through the list of available settings and specify the one I need. Now when I find the setting I want, let's scroll down and let's look at power. There was one called power there. These are all the settings that are available in the settings catalog. I might want to choose allow hibernate, and that doesn't allow hibernate, that simply allows me to configure it, and I can either block it or allow it, and I can choose next, assign it, and then review and create the policy. So that's how you configure a device configuration policy. Now, when I look at Windows devices in general and specify a device, let me look at this one here. You'll see across the top, we've got the name of the device, and then right across the top here, we've got some device actions. We can retire the device, we can wipe it, we can delete it, we can synchronize the policy with the device, we can restart it, and we've got these three dots here. Now, depending on the size of your screen, the information that you'll see across the top here will differ. And if I choose those three dots, these are all the other actions we can take with the devices section. A whole load of stuff we can do. Next, let's look briefly at endpoint security, because it's the next in our list. I want to just cover it. Now, across the top, right at the top, we have overview, all devices, security baselines, and security tasks. I really do not like these sections here. So all devices is great, but I've got a different view of that. I normally go into devices, and that's where I find my devices. So that's not really useful for me. Now with baselines, we get a list of baselines that are available in the environment. Now, I personally am not a fan of security baselines. It sounds like a great idea to have a baseline, Microsoft configured security baseline, but most Intune admins, at least advanced Intune admins who have been using the solution for a long time, will avoid security baselines if they can, because we can specify all these things much more granularly down here. So, for example, if I look at the security baseline for Windows 10 and later, I'll go into that. I will choose Create Profile, choose Create, and give it a name. I'll choose Next. Now, this shows you all of the items that you should probably configure. So it's already got them configured. So prevent enabling lock screen camera enabled. Prevent enabling lock screen slideshow enabled. All of these settings are the things that Microsoft recommend you do in order to be secure. This is great, right? This is gonna give you a good base level of security. If you're new to Intune and you have a responsibility for deploying security to your devices, this is probably a good place to start. But it's not the place you should be looking to be if you're an enterprise organization or if you're a very well-developed Intune organization. Most well-developed Intune organizations will be running their own separate policies. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to close out of this. And another reason for avoiding it is because there's so many conflicts when you deploy security baselines that because they cover such a breadth of configurations, you might not realize there's a setting in there like the lock screen camera, for example. You might need the lock screen camera enabled, and you might enable it in one of your configuration profiles. It's disabled in the security baseline. That's just going to cause a conflict and mean that you've got a red flag within your environment saying that there's a problem. So it's not obvious where these settings are configured if you use the baseline because it covers such a broad scope. Anyway, I'll go back to the Endpoint Security Blade, and what we have here is this Manage section. Now, in the Manage section, we can manage antivirus, disk encryption, firewall, endpoint privilege management, which is an advanced license feature, endpoint detection and response, which is Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, App Control for Business, which is kind of like App Locker, but a newer version, or Windows Defender Application Control. So that's that section there. Attack Surface Reduction, which is basic security, basic stuff you should do within the Windows environment. You should enable some attack surface reduction rules to protect against obvious things that attackers typically try to target. Account protection, this is all about protecting the user on the device and the local administrator on the device, for example. Device compliance and conditional access. Now, conditional access is very, very important, but far too specific for this video. I'm not going to go into conditional access in any kind of depth. So with all of these different features available in the Endpoint Security Blade, it's definitely somewhere you should start when you're starting to configure security. And as I say, you can just look at the baseline. You can just go to the top there and use a baseline. But if you really do care about security and really do care about making sure that there are no conflicts in the environment, I would recommend you manage your own policies as you work through these. Next, we have reports. Now, Intune's always had a bit of a bad rap for reporting because it didn't have that many reports built in out of the box. Now, though, we have quite a few. So we have device attestation status. Now, the issue with all of these, especially when I'm doing a demonstration, is that it takes quite a while to generate all these reports. Device attestation, as you can see, we've got 8 not started, 3 completed, 5 failed. This is whether the device has been able to make a secure connection to the security hardware on the device itself. In some cases, it looks like it's not started. In some cases, it looks like it's actually failed. Now, these are virtual machines, so maybe it's not enabled on those devices. But this is a good view for you to look at. Ideally, get as many as you can in the completed section here. Otherwise, there's a link up here you can click to troubleshoot that. Then we have device compliance. Now I mentioned that the device compliance in my environment was actually pretty bad because I do a lot of testing, and really it's a lab environment that I'm running here, so I won't expect to see most devices to be compliant because they're off quite a lot. But we have 10 devices that are compliant, that's pretty good, 11 that are non-compliant, and a total of 21 devices. So this is a good view for you. As you can see, the reporting here is much better than, okay, maybe you don't know what it was like in the past. It was pretty ropey in the past. It is much better now. We have this nice overview report here. We can choose reports, and we can go into much more depth in these reports and filter and export into PDFs and Excel. It's much, much better. Now, down the left-hand side here, you can see I've got users and groups. Now, I don't have specific Intune users. This is not users in Intune. This is still Microsoft 365 users, Microsoft Entra ID users. And in fact, when I click on this section here, this users section, it will take me to Entra ID. So this is exactly the same as the Entra ID view. If I choose users on my Entra ID section here, choose all users, this will look exactly the same. You can see the exact same features. So 31 users, and over in Intune 31 users. So this is just a view into Entra ID. And the same applies with groups. When I go to groups, we've got the same groups that are available within Entra ID. That's how this works. Intune just uses Entra ID for its users and groups sections. Finally, we have tenant administration. Now with tenant administration, this really is where you go into the back end of Intune and start configuring some of the settings. I really don't want to go into all of these right now, but if we have a quick look down, you can see we have tenant status. This is the information about the tenant. The connector status, this gives you a good overview of when your connectors will expire. You can see I've got APNS that I mentioned earlier on for Apple, Device Enrollment Program, VPP, the last sync date for Autopilot, all the information about my critical dates are mentioned here. And then finally, we've got Service Health and Message Center. At the moment, there are no incidents or outages within Entra ID or Intune. That's it. That is the overview of Microsoft Intune. Now, we do want to go into much more depth about Windows Autopilot, and there is a Windows Autopilot guide available on my channel already. Take a look at that. There isn't necessarily a guide yet about apps, and I'm about to record that over this next week. So if you are waiting for a guide on how to deploy applications in your Intune environment, stick around, subscribe. I'll let you know. See you.